Good morning, boys and girls. I'm back with the Quilt story. This book was written by Tony Johnston, and illustrated by Tommy DePaulo. And we've read some of Tommy DePaulo's books this year. The Legend of the Bluebonnet, I believe. So this is called The Quilt Story, and again we're reading this book because we're studying the letter Q, and it has the word that starts with the letter Q. A little girl's mother made the quilt to keep her warm when the snow came down long ago. She stitched the quilt by a yellow flame, humming all the time. She stitched the tails of falling stars, and she stitched the name Abigail. Abigail, we have you in our class, Abigail. Abigail loved the quilt. She wrapped it round her in the quiet dark and watched the winter skies. Sometimes she saw a falling star. Sometimes Abigail played in the woods near her home. She had tea, her dolls had tea, and the quilt had tea all over it. There she is wrapped up in the quilt. And here she is having a picnic and tea on the quilt. Sometimes she pretended the quilt was a gown. She wore it to town on her horse. Clop, clop, clop. And it tore. So her mother stitched it up once more. Here she is wearing it as a gown. And here's her mother stitching it up. You can see her name on the quilt perfectly there. Sometimes she played hide and seek with her sisters. She laughed and cried, "Don't peek," and hid under the quilt, and everyone found her. Sometimes Abigail was sick. She sneezed and sneezed. Then she slept under the quilt, and she felt better. Here she is hiding from her sisters. Here she is when she's feeling ill. One day, Abigail's family moved away across wide rivers and over a rock-hard trail. There they are in the covered wagons. The quilt went too, not stuffed in trunks with blankets and clothes. It kept the little girls warm from the wild winds, warm from the rain, warm from the sparkling nights. Look at the beautiful stars. They built a new house in the woods. Abigail's father built it with his hatchet. Chop, chop, chop. He built her a new bed. Chip, chip, chip. He made her a new horse, too. He worked until curly shavings covered the floor, and everyone sneezed and said, "Welcome home," and was glad. And Abigail felt sad. They are in their new house. Her new bed. And the new horse. Wonder why she's feeling sad. Let's continue reading. New house, new horse, new bed. Everything smelled of fresh chops and chips. Everything but the quilt. So her mother rocked her, as mothers do, then tucked her in, and Abigail felt at home again under the quilt. I bet you like it when your mom rocks you or your dad rocks you. One day, when the quilt was very old and very loved, Abigail folded it carefully and put it in the attic. Everyone forgot it was there. A gray mouse came and loved the quilt. Her babies were born on top of the quilt. They grew fat and gray in the warm stuffing. When they got hungry, they ate a falling star. Here she is. This is where she put it, in the attic. Sometimes that's out above your garage or above your house where you store treasures. And here's the mouse family. You see they're eating the falling star. A raccoon came and loved the quilt. She dug a hole in a corner with her black paws and hid an apple there. Look closely at that picture. There's the apple. Ooh, this way. A cat came and loved the quilt, a patchwork cat. It rolled on the stars and stuffing spilled out like snow. Then the cat curled up in the snow and purred. There's the cat. I love that they called her a patchwork cat. It looks like my kitties. I'll show you my kitties in a little bit. Kitty, kitty, called a little girl. She found her cat, and she found the quilt splashed with patterns of sun. The little girl wrapped the quilt round her, and she loved it too. Can you make it like new? She asked her mother. So her mother patched the holes. She pushed fresh stuffing in, the stitch long tails on the stars to swish across. She stitched long tails on the stars to swish across the quilt again. I got tongue-tied. I'm wondering if you're figuring out this story, what's happening. One day, the little girl's family moved away, across miles and miles of pavement and snaking gray highways. They found a new house, freshly cleaned, freshly waxed, freshly painted white. There's the family moving. There's their new house. They unpacked and unpacked all night, and everyone sneezed on cardboard dust and said, "Welcome home," and was glad. And the little girl felt sad. We've heard that before in the story. Everything smelled of white paint and boxes, everything but the quilt. So her mother rocked her as mothers do, then tucked her in, and she felt at home again under the quilt. Now, is that Abigail? I want you to think about the story. And there's the whole quilt that says Abigail. When the story started, the little girl named Abigail, look, Mom was sewing by candlelight. And when they traveled, they weren't traveling in cars. They were traveling, does anybody remember how they traveled? By covered wagons. The horses were pulling the wagons. And then as the story went on, she had put the quilt up in the attic, and I think years passed, years and years passed, and this is a new little girl that found the quilt. Maybe it's a relative, maybe it's just a new little girl that lives in the house. But you can see this is more modern times. The fence outside, And then when they move, you can see in the background, there's a moving van and the car. So this is a lot later. So that's the story about the quilt, called The Quilt Story. Now you are going to make your own quilt and write me a couple of sentences about your quilt. Does anybody have a special quilt that they sleep with or cuddle under when your parents are rocking you? I'd love to see a picture of a quilt if you have one. All right, I hope you enjoyed this story. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.